science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. We continue our journey having conversations with contemporary thinkers on architecture and architectural thinking, and today I'm talking to Martino Stierli, who's the Philip Johnson Curator of Modern Architecture and Design at MOMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And what we are talking about, of course, is the exhibition that is currently until July 2nd on display at MOMA, entitled The Project of Independence, Architectures of Decolonization in South Asia 1947 to 1985. And what I'm trying to understand from him is how this exhibition should be considered to be different from other South Asian exhibitions at MOMA, and indeed how it is that the idea of decolonization is written into the title of the exhibition, which is a complex concept which entangles with the difficulties of moving beyond, if you like, the post-colonial situation, of the situation of being somehow always in the thrall of a mythological West as the center of the world. And this becomes a particular problem when an exhibition on the margins, on South Asia, is staged at one of the centers of the center, which is MOMA. And so I try and talk to him about how he imagined, he engaged with and conceived this difficulty in the process of being one of the curators of this very interesting and fascinating exhibition. I hope you enjoy the conversation. As always, please do reach out to me if you have any comments or if you have any ideas about people I could be inviting as guests on this podcast. My email is vikram.prakash@gmail.com. Look forward to hearing from you, and here we go. Well, welcome to Architecture Talk, Martino. So nice of you to agree to have this conversation with me. I have really enjoyed working and collaborating with you and being part of various conversations that you have hosted at MOMA. Of course, very excited about the exhibition, The Project of Independence, that is currently on view in the museum, which for the first time, I'm so excited to say, brings together South Asian modernism in a significant way to US and international audiences. So thank you a lot for doing that. And today I thought, we'd have a conversation not so much on the holdings of the exhibition, which are available and we can go see, but really about your experience as the curator, what it felt like to put this together, what you were thinking, what some of the challenges were, and what your experience has been. So why don't I just start by saying, what was the concept? What was the driving concept behind this exhibition? Besides having South Asian modernism on display, what was the impetus for doing this exhibition? And in a sense, what was your personal interest in this?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Vikram, for having me today. It's a pleasure. And also thank you for your kind words on the exhibition, which you have been generous enough to visit multiple times, so you're the ideal visitor and interlocutor for this conversation. So
Thank you.
In terms of the, driving concept, I usually say there were probably three main objectives, in conceptualizing this exhibition. The first one being obviously the one objective you already mentioned, bringing to the foreground, raising to the level of attention a body of work of, extraordinary historical and architectural / aesthetic significance from a part of the world that really has not been given the due attention that it deserves in the histories of architecture as they've been written until quite recently. And so we focus on this, first generation of architects who were active post-independent as opposed to many of the architects from abroad, some of whom are, of course, quite famous figures such as Louis Kahn or Le Corbusier. I mean, we do also address some of their work obliquely in the exhibition, but the real focus of the exhibition is really on this first generation of architects who were actively engaged in giving shape and form to the newly independent societies in which they were working. And that, of course, brings me to the second objective, and I think it's already evident in the title, The Project of Independence, Architectures of Decolonization in South Asia, that we were interested in foregrounding the notion that modern architecture served as an active agent in the transformation, in the progressive, idealistic transformation of these newly independent societies in their quest for self-determination. And so, and the third, objective, that's really underlay our concept is to also raise awareness for the heritage question, the fact that many of these buildings have been destroyed or are under more or less acute threat of demolition or are facing an uncertain future because there is not an immediate, resolution what could be the future use. So we also wanted to sort of foreground a bit the question of how many of these buildings have or have not become part of the everyday life of many, millions of people in the subcontinent.
I mean, so to drill down a little bit on the second part, on your second objective, I mean, and I know you have worked on Eastern European modernism as well. Is this special to sort of this, whatever we want to call it, mid-century modernism or post-colonial modernism, this idea of architecture as an important and integral part of nation building? Or is there something specific, do you think, from the political circumstances of South Asia and some other places that makes this a particular thing in these places? What have you learned in this process?
Well, yeah, I mean, thank you for referencing Toward a Concrete Utopia, which looked at a very, very similar time frame in Yugoslavia. And of course, Yugoslavia has a very different political history than, South Asia. But there is, of course, the overarching shared space of the non-aligned movement, which is interesting, which we don't foreground so much, but there is this connection. And for me as a curator, I very much see these two exhibitions as very closely interlinked. And your question is a very interesting one, because I do think that the post-war situation, the global post-war situation, which of course coincides with the independence movements in large parts of the global South, does for the first time allow modern architecture to take on such a significant part in a political project. We see this also in other parts of the world. It's very well known in Western Europe, to some degree in North America, that this kind of modernist architecture, sometimes called also brutalist architecture, later on very much becomes the signifier of the social democratic projects of that period. And I see, what was going on in Yugoslavia, this third way, this idea of sort of gapping between communism and capitalism, but also in South Asia, as this idea of creating nations of self-determination. I see that as a common theme of the period that unfolds in different, political registers, but they all share a progressive outlook to the future. And from a contemporary perspective, where I think we have a little bit lost this belief in progressive vision of the future, I find it important as a curator and for us as historians to remind our audiences that, architecture did play this very significant role in these important, political projects.
Right.
And so, yeah.
Yeah, but I wonder if you would put a finer point on that. And you've drawn out a continuity, let's say, between the South Asian project and the Yugoslavian project and sort of progressivist notions in the Western European and North American context. Yeah. But I wonder what is the differentiation between the adoption? Because, I don't see any major, there's the Boston municipal building, of course, but modern architecture, brutalist art, was not adopted in such a big way as a symbol of the nation state or the nation in the West, was it not? And why do you think there is this distinction at that same time?
Well, I mean, I think especially the United States, of course, special, has never the same kind of embrace of a statist vision as, in other parts, like in Western Europe. I do think we see that in Great Britain. We see a strong, I think, nexus between, the welfare state and brutalism, also in France, for example. But, of course, what makes South Asia unique is this, this real moment of complete reinvention in a way. Of course, we also know that's not true. We know that the colonial in many ways, continues, gets transformed and so on. But there is this idea of, creating something that is entirely new and that will project, a future that was unlike anything before. And so in that sense, I do think it's maybe a radicalization, and it was a strong embrace. And I think it was also, of course, very much part of the vision of the political leaders, as it was of the architects. And I think that is, something that makes this, in a way very specific and unique to South Asia. And of course, what I also, should say in this respect, and I write about this in my catalog, of course, there are also the economic conditions, which are very, very different. We can say, South Asia is to a large part, an agrarian society as it comes out of colonization. It's not entirely true, but it's not a very, far advanced industrial economy. And so that means that the whole building sector, the whole idea of implementing and appropriating modernism as part of a trajectory of nationhood, has direct consequences on how the buildings look, how they're built, how they're designed. For example, the idea that the concrete has this rough surface is not just, an aesthetic preference. It's actually, one could argue, a direct representation of the means of production that are available to the architects and builders at that time. The fact that many of the construction of many of these buildings relied on manual labor. And, we have these incredible images of construction sites in the exhibition, which I really think are stunning to see, because they give really meaning and texture to the question of what it meant to build such bold, visionary, modernist buildings in the context of the available means of construction and financial and economic and so on and so forth.
Right. And I know that in your essay and other places in the exhibition, this idea of limitations of means as actually a pathway to innovation. Yeah. And innovation that can be instructive for the present and beyond sort of making do with less is an important theme. But to stay a little bit with the discussion that we are having, of course, Brazil also counts in this register of nation modernism, and numerous places, Tel Aviv, Ankara, so on and so forth. But to turn a little bit towards your curatorial role as the chief curator of architecture and design. Of course, MoMA has had earlier exhibits. For instance, in Brazil, there was a big exhibition. I wonder and how you would differentiate the modernist, whatever term you want to use, post-colonial or global or non-Western vision of curating such shows today from what they were earlier? I mean, what is the continuity and differences, do you think?
No, it's a very interesting question. I mean, I would say Latin America is maybe a bit a special case from a North American perspective, because of course, while North America never formally colonized Latin America, there is certainly a very strong economic dependency that lives on to the present day. And so to some degree, I think the North American interest, MoMA's interest at mid-century in Latin American architecture, which was very advanced. I mean, we know that. Also, I think has to be seen in the larger context of sort of the geopolitical situation at that time. So there, in a way, the MoMA's interest, or the North American interest in the culture of Latin America, I think is a bit a special case that is different from sort of the more global outlook that we're pursuing today. I mean, it's true, of course, there was also an exhibition on Indian textiles as early as the mid-1950s. So that was not entirely not part of the conversation, but it was a very, maybe a little bit orientalizing understanding of the subcontinent.
Well, I would certainly argue. I mean, I can say that.
Yeah. So exactly. So I don't want to, criticize or openly criticize my predecessors, but I think it was a different historical moment also. But I do not think that until the very recent period, we actually embraced the challenge of destabilizing the Western canon to the degree that we're doing that now. And, I do think this is a very, very important stepping corner, or what's the stepping point in our institutional history, which of course reflects things that have been happening in academia for a while now. And so I do think it's just necessary and consequent that we also do this on our platform, which will allow us to reach many audiences who are not naturally following academic discourses to the degree that we as scholars do.
Yeah. That's I think a important turn. Which has been, like you noted, in place in academia for a while, and it's great to see places like MoMA entering into that discourse and that discussion. But to sort of continue with this thread of curation and your role in it, you just held a wonderful panel in which you invited Sanjay Kanvende, Nandita, myself, and others to talk about our experience of growing up in South Asia. Not as architects and scholars, but more at a personal level, what it felt like to be kids of modernists, if you like, which I enjoyed very much because so many ways, what one works on, inevitably comes down to things that one is invested in emotionally, personally. So if I may ask, how did you get into all of this sort of period of architecture, what is your personal motivation for looking at South Asia or when even mid-century modernism? How did you back into this?
Well, South Asia, I mean, I traveled to India for the first time in my early 20s as a student, as a backpacker, and I spent about 3 months on the road. And it was, in many ways, a transformative experience. It was, it was an assault on sort of my, European, Central European upbringing, diving into a world that was very different from what I knew. And
why did you go to India? Just discovery of India, or
just discovery of India. I mean, maybe I was also following some kind of orientalizing impulse, this sort of interest, in diving into a world that I just didn't know. And it's my curiosity.
Sure.
I was also, of course, not. There's a whole sort of generations of Europeans have obviously done that, and I think continue to do it. So it's in a way a little bit of a global grand tour in that sense.
Right.
I did visit at that time Chandigarh. I mean, I was already, I was a student of art history at University of Zurich, so I obviously wanted to see that. And the images, not just the images from Chandigarh, but from all the other places I visited, Delhi, and in places in Rajasthan, also Ahmedabad, and so on. They did stay in my head. I mean, they created a sense of they just left a deep impact on me. Many years, I didn't ever work on modernism in South Asia until I started working on this show. But when I, was being interviewed for my job at MOMA here, which I started in 2015, so the interviews would have taken place before then, the idea of this show was one of the things that I pitched as something I wanted to do, and it definitely has to do with my own sort of personal journey with that early experience as a young adult traveling in South Asia. But it also, I think, has to do with a general reflection of I, as a historian from my generation working in this time, feel there's a lot of work to do in post-war, the second half of the 20th century modern architecture that just hasn't been fully explored. And it seemed that South Asia would be the logical starting point, because South Asia was really the global region that reached independence from colonial rule at the very beginning. And so in that sense, I believe it served as a blueprint for many other developments across the global south. So in that sense, I also felt it would be a good place to start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it is amazing when you read the literature from the 1950s. You see, Prime Minister Nehru showing up for seminars on architecture, and,
Incredible.
not just inaugurating buildings because he's the big man, which would be common, but he had opinions on the discipline and its profession and its aesthetics and its future and so on. And in a sense, in a strange perversion of that, I would say, that has not gone away. We think of our own president, Mr. Donald Trump's order against modern architecture. You remember the executive order that he put out. There is still a kind of, and of course, things that are happening in India with the new political order and in many other places. And we remember in the 80s, Prince Charles jumped into the fray on this whole question. Architecture continues to have a hold on expansive political imaginations, right? But it can shift in many ways. It can have so many valences, right? I mean, even if we think about 9/11, why crash aeroplanes into buildings of iconic structure? It has a certain resonance, carries an impact in the social and public sphere. I guess what I'm trying to get to is, you have mentioned progressive socialism, progressive modernism a few times as a driving agenda. But I wonder, what has happened along the way that sort of the same modern architecture has become the target of other political forces? Is there a political agenda for the exhibition in some way?
I mean, this is a very complicated and complex question, and I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer it in detail also, with the various places around the world. But I do think, as an architectural historian, what we could probably say is that, as you was just saying yourself, that the symbolic meaning that is attributed to modernist architecture has changed dramatically from periods that, from this period that we're looking at in our exhibition, the immediate, the second half of the 20th century to now. And of course, we know that has many reasons. Along the way, I think many of us have lost a little bit the belief in the promises that were connected to these, to these buildings. Many have been disillusioned, many have been disappointed. Also, many political leaders who were the carriers of these hopes have disappointed us and have perverted maybe the original ideas that, they had stood up for. And, that is, of course, extremely unfortunate. Nevertheless, for me, as a person living in the present, where, I find it difficult to sometimes not despair, given, the incredible challenges that we as a humanity, as a collective humanity, but also as citizens of this world face, I find it edifying and helpful to look back and see that there is a possibility of sharing a belief in a better future, and in the ability of architecture to give form to that future and to engage with the needs and wants of the people. And of course, we can have micro conversations about, does an individual building do that, or did it succeed in the long run? It's not always the case. Maybe it's not even the case in most instances, but at least there was this idealistic hope. And, and so I do think that is worth entertaining for us to think about where we stand in our own present and where we want to go from here.
Yeah. No, I concur with you in one sense that certainly the modernist ideologues and their political backers can be said to have overstated their claims and goals, and can be argued for having not delivered. And therefore, there is a sort of a disenchantment and a lack of expectation of what architecture can do.
Sorry, don't want to interrupt, but another thought. I also believe there has been in place for several decades now a pretty outspoken project of delegitimizing that political vision. I think the whole neoliberal turn since the 1990s has been a project of delegitimizing the, what I've called the idealistic vision of the previous generation. So it's not just, it's not always just the failure of the architects and the politicians who were, active at that period. It's also the, politicians and, leaders who have been in charge since then, who have been trying to dismantling, those visions because they don't share, the underlying, I think, agendas.
Yeah, the socialist agenda, or rather the idea that the nation and the nation state should be at the vanguard of social transformation, is an idea that certainly has been ceded to the visions of large corporations, let's just say. And you can hope that they're progressive, but probably not. But let's spend a few more minutes on the period, let's say, between 1970 and 1990, those 20 years, which we would describe, well, in architectural discourse as the kind of postmodern critiques of modernism, when sort of modernist socialism was specifically targeted and denigrated and held up for castigation, and still held up in many schools of architecture as highly problematic, with Pruitt-Igoe, etc., as being our favorite whipping dogs. And even though Corbusier built one building in North America, he is still often held up as the bad guy. Wouldn't you add postmodernist discourse in architecture? Postmodernism is a broad term. I'm just specifically referring to classic, architectural aesthetic postmodernism, as partly also responsible for this decline in thinking about progressive modernism.
I'm not sure I agree with that. I mean, obviously, that's one reading that's quite common. And, as you probably know, I actually wrote my PhD on Robert Ventura and Denise Scott Brown's Learning from Las Vegas. So in a way, I'm very familiar with the postmodern critique of the modernist project.
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily think, at least, from the point of view where I'm coming from, Ventura and Scott Brown in particular, that they were actually interested in dismantling the societal vision behind modernism. I believe they understood their position firmly rooted within the modernist project, but trying to re-engage with the original ethos of modernism, of being relevant to society, hence their interest in sociology, in everyday vernacular, in iconographies that they saw as, talk about whether or not that's legitimate. But, I think it was a genuine re-engagement with the original tenets of modernism, which of course led them to a very different sort of aesthetic reformulation. But I think, this re-engagement with vernacularisms and with historical forms was not just a formalism. This was really seriously trying to re-engage with architecture as part of a larger social project. And of course, what then, was made out of that proposition and became POMO, for me, is a perversion, and has nothing to do with the original, I think, critical impetus of that first generation of postmodernists. So,
yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, complexity and contradiction, even learning from Las Vegas, and sort of all those things were mainstream is almost all right kind of thinking. Can be said to belong to the same lineage of Team 10, even Louis Kahn, etc., trying to sort of resituate modernist ideology. And at some point, it just got, if you want, hijacked into a kind of aesthetic claim.
A neo-corporate style, which it really was then, right? POMO becomes this...
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it also, beyond that, gets internationalized. I mean, I was shocked at how this as an aesthetic movement showed up on the shores of India, for instance, when I was a young student. And many of the finest modernists suddenly were doing, let's just say, strange buildings. And my personal life was kind of a crisis, which prompted me to get out of practice and go pursue a PhD, which I've never regretted. But just a matter of narrative, how things played out. So I think there's something interesting to be written about. It'd be interesting to see how you and other scholars who have worked on postmodernism, start to clarify all this longer term from the 50 to the 2000s. I think would be interesting thing to think. But I want to turn the conversation a little bit to more towards, in the last 10, 15 minutes, to the specifics of the exhibition, if you like. I know from growing up in India, we say in India, nothing can be done, but everything is possible.
I like that.
What were the challenges for you in putting this exhibition together?
I mean, there's the obvious challenge of the pandemic, which, of course, delayed the project for a few months and made it extremely, difficult to access material for a while. Fortunately, I have to say, we had done most of the research on the ground, before the pandemic hit in. My last planned trip happened in January 2020. That was to Pakistan. That was the, last remaining country among the four that, we wanted to have in the exhibition. So in that sense, we were fortunate. I think, a structural challenge besides the pandemic was the fact that there is not a very strong infrastructure of collecting and preserving the legacy of modernist architecture in the subcontinent. There's not a national archive that collects. Of course, there's the SEPT, for example, in Andermatt, which is a very good job at collecting some of the works of these architects. But as a general, it was a very complicated undertaking to first, find out where original materials, particularly drawings, historical photographs, sometimes even models, were located, and if they even, still existed. And, that's of course not unique to South Asia. We had, a bit of a similar challenge in Yugoslavia too, but I would say it was definitely exacerbated in South Asia, which has, of course, all kinds of different reasons. But I would say that was a challenge, and it meant, it meant a really sustained investigation that, went on for several years, and it meant the involvement of many people on the ground who helped us, identify individuals or, their offices or their successors, and really to establish this network that led us to, in the end, be able to include dozens of lenders from, many countries, which make up this exhibition. But that was a real challenge, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder what your experience has been working with the South Asian architectural intellectual community, because I know, and I consider myself to be an expat part of that. They have been very active in the last decade or so, particularly in the face of the challenges that modernism is facing. There are, and not just in architecture, in many of the aesthetic disciplines. Of course, Doshi and Korea have had big exhibitions, but I think, I know that Ram Rahman and Sahmat, I think, put together a very nice exhibition also on South Asian modernism. There's also a nice re-evaluation and recognition. I think it all started with the Hall of Nations demolition time, I think, was the sort of it. A lot of people came together. Did you engage much with besides the offices, did you engage with the sort of broader community of South Asian architectural modernists?
Absolutely. Thank you for mentioning Ram Rahman, for example. He came to MOMA quite a few years ago to, actually several times to deliver lectures. And, so he was one of those people. I mean, there's many people who wrote in the catalog. We have about 10 or 12 thematic essays that look at very specific aspects of South Asian modernism. So, we really wanted to include these voices, many of whom, are either based in South Asia or originally from there, to also create a sense of polyphony, to sort of strengthen the voices in the field and give them a platform, the MOMA platform to articulate their important, scholarship, in front of a larger audience. So yes, I mean, we also, we had we formed an advisory board that included many of the leading scholars. We met with them several times throughout. So, they were an important sounding board for ideas and, would give us critical feedback. So, that's, I think, very, very important for us, given, also the geopolitical situation, operating in a Western institution that stands also for a certain, not always unproblematic relationship with other parts of the world. It is, a challenge also to make sure that this project is not seen as a, you know, a neo-colonial takeover, an imposition of an idea of the West on the region. And for this reason, we feel it's very, very important to include, you know, voices from and you know, intellectuals from the region, and who have been, you know, deeply invested in that. I should also say, and I think that's something, you know, that you are probably also very aware of, there is, of course, a very, very pronounced, highly theorized post-colonial discourse, which I think is almost the hegemonic discourse with regard to the culture of modernity in that part of the world. And I think our project wanted to deliberately reframe the questions by looking really specifically at the material culture and the artifacts. I feel as a curator, and I think you may share this idea with me, that, you know, many of these very theoretical, super interesting and, you know, enriching discourses often lack a grounding in the actual material history of the place. And so for that sense, we felt there is a gap between the theorization and the presence of the artifacts that were lacking an actual, I mean, they were not lacking. I mean, you, of course, are somebody who did this kind of work, but I feel it's almost a minority position within the larger field of you know, the larger discursive field relating to South Asia.
Yeah, I mean, material cultures is a kind of a new field which is starting to permeate into literary criticism, cultural studies.
Right.
And it's great to sort of link this, as your exhibition does, to architectural criticism at this point. But I want to come back a little bit and dwell for a moment on what you have indicated is a delicate and complex situation, which is that of, you know, articulating a haloed and even problematic and celebrated institution like MOMA in the context of a, let's say, decolonizing or post-colonial enterprise, and with a new politics, and ethics, if you like. I mean, it's a tough tightrope balance, is it not? Or do you think it's quite straightforward and you simply reframe the discourse? How do you think about that?
No, I mean, it is a tightrope for sure. And, you know, I do think we would open ourselves to justified criticism if we were not actively and actually engaging with the intellectuals and the scholars who can speak with confidence about this subject matter. And I think that's why this, you know, idea, this notion of polyphony, is so important for us to give voice to these, you know, to these individuals and their thoughts. And, you know, another thing that was very important for us, I think, as curators, was to be in constant conversation also with the architects who we wanted to feature. So again, not just instrumentalizing their buildings in order to tell whatever story we wanted to tell. We tried to listen and understand what it was that was driving them and that made them design these buildings. And so I think our exhibition and our book that came out of it is a testimony to this effort. And I think that's not a straightforward way. It's much more complicated and time consuming than, you know, just doing whatever you want. But I do think it's the only way that is credible from our position. And so, you know, we try our best. We probably didn't succeed in every instance, but I do believe I am proud of what we have achieved, and I'm also happy to see that the architects and the people who are engaged are happy with the outcome, and so that gives me, you know, a lot of empowerment for future projects, maybe of a similar ambition.
Yeah, no, in fact, no, I must note this and credit you and the curatorial team for ensuring that the exhibition doesn't work with a sort of a monolithic vision, and that it works hard to not only produce diversity of representation in the architects represented, but also in the academic and intellectual voices present in the catalog. So it is polyphonous, and I think that is rich and has the potential, and we'll see what happens, of opening up a further discourse on this. Hopefully, we'll see a lot more of that. So as we move to the end here, my last question is, what was your biggest surprise as you were putting this exhibition together? What did you totally not expect, and suddenly it was there?
Probably not a single big surprise. There are many surprises along the way. The sense of excitement that a curator feels when going to an architect's office and finding out all of a sudden that there is wonderful drawings that have been rolled up for years or even decades, and nobody's looked at them since they were maybe used back in the day for this or that. That is, something, that creates a lot of surprises, and, in a very exciting way. I remember, for example, visiting the office of Acute Convinde, which is still active with, his son playing an active role, who was also part of the conversation that you were invoking. And that was a huge surprise, to see that even though nobody seems to really have known about it, there's actually an incredible, archive there that would totally justify a monographic exhibition. I'm just using Convinde now as an example. We experienced that with other architects too. So this, there's not this one big surprise that completely changed my thinking and, transformed everything else, but there were these series of surprises that really gave me a sense of, reinforced again the sense of how incredibly rich this history there is. And we really only, to some degree, only touch on its surface. There's so much more research to be done there. And I do hope that through this exhibition, this will also be an encouragement to younger scholars to continue writing those histories.
Martino, thank you for being on this podcast and for all the work that you have done for this exhibition and other places.
Thank you so much, Vikram, for all the work you have done. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.